talking with Dr. Ruth Reisman today, an audiologist out of New York, and we're going to discuss the over-the-counter hearing aids versus prescription hearing aids and what you need to know. Doctor, thank you for taking the time to be with us today. Tell me a little bit about your background, if you would.
Sure. Yes, it's an honor to be here and to discuss this topic. So I am, as you stated, an audiologist and actually a full-time professor here in New York City, focused on audiology and teaching audiology doctoral students in the City University of New York. I do have a private practice in New York as well, where I focus predominantly on auditory processing disorders and other hearing disorders, as well as rehabilitation. So that does involve a lot of hearing aids, cochlear implants, bone conduction devices, therapy, everything that falls under rehab and support for patients with hearing loss and other hearing disorders.
Okay. So, all right. So we kind of threw this at you today, over-the-counter hearing aids versus prescription. What are your first thoughts when somebody says that out loud?
Yeah, so I think, and actually what I actually tell my patients is there are as many hearing aids as there are individuals. And there's ultimately a reason for that. Every person's background, every person's hearing loss, every person's insurance coverage and financial need varies and is different, as well as their communication needs, right? So everyone finds themselves in different environments and has different communication needs and ways that they connect with others. So I think the amount of solutions, whether it's over-the-counter or prescription hearing aids, are warranted because there are as many people as there are solutions, and we need to make sure that we're appropriately guiding the patient in what their communication needs are and supporting them in what works best for their kind of profile and their lifestyle.
Okay. So if somebody is just starting their process, they realize, hey, there's something wrong, I need to hear better. They're just beginning to research it. How would you explain the difference just between OTC, over-the-counter, and prescription devices? What are the basics?
Yeah, sure. So over-the-counter hearing aids is a direct-to-consumer option. So that means, similar to what you suggested, someone thinks they have an issue. It's never really been explored. They may do like an online hearing evaluation or hearing screening, really. And they've been identified to have some level of hearing loss or some level of difficulty. And they're curious about, what would it sound like to hear better? And that's like the typical profile when I'm managing a patient who, let's say, decides to pursue an over-the-counter device. They are usually curious whether they have some level of hearing loss. They'll do an online hearing test and they'll test drive an over-the-counter hearing aid. Most of the time, it's a generically fit device that's meant for individuals that have mild to moderate hearing loss. There's minimal flexibility in terms of how the adjustments can be made. They'll usually maybe have some application or something that gives them a little bit of control. But for the most part, it's meant to be like a one size fits all. So there's some element of customization, let's say, for the patient when it's direct to consumer, but it's not like a prescription hearing aid that's really not only fine-tuned with the individual's hearing levels and prescriptions based off of a comprehensive hearing test and an audiogram, but also in terms of the fit of the ear that is highly customized to the patient.
Okay. So who ends up taking online? I didn't even realize there were online hearing tests available. That's interesting. Who ends up being the best candidates for the over-the-counter, and then who should just obviously go to a doctor, get some professional help, and go for a prescription one?
Yeah, I would say if someone is fairly confident, like let's say they've already had a hearing test at an ear, nose, and throat physician or at an audiologist's office, and they're fairly confident that their hearing loss is due to an inner ear or nerve-related hearing loss, or that there's no medical or surgical intervention that's required for their ears, then and they've already maybe know that they need a hearing aid but are not ready to take that leap into prescription hearing aids, I think that's always a great option. So like I said, in terms of the patients that I've seen with that profile, it's that profile. The patient knows that they have a hearing loss. They know that they potentially can hear better. They're either not ready to financially invest in a prescription hearing aid, they don't have prescription coverage, or they're just curious to see, what is it like to hear better. I just recently had a patient that I did a hearing test on, and they obviously needed hearing aids. And she said, it's not something that I'm ready for. And I'm not one to pressure patients. And I'll just say that's fine. But we know there's hearing loss, so we just should reevaluate every year, make sure that things are staying stable, nothing is changing. If something changes, you come back. And she became curious now about, what is it like potentially to hear better? And she purchased an over-the-counter hearing aid, and she noticed that she was hearing so much better and realized, okay, maybe I do need a hearing aid. And then that made her curious about prescription hearing aids and what the difference was. So she ultimately started with an over-the-counter, and that opened her palate to hearing better and wanting a prescription hearing aid.
I on a personal note here, my my wife and I have had this, we'll call it a discussion, and she has some hearing loss that she's admitted to, and I've tried to convince her, let's try these and no go. Doesn't want to have anything to do with that. What is that hesitation?
Yeah, I think patients, one, either they don't realize what they're missing, right? So I was glad that this patient was curious about, whether my recommendation and my diagnosis was actually accurate. And then she tried it and saw that she was probably missing more than she realized, right? So when you don't know what you're missing, they're like, I'm just fine. I'm functioning in my day-to-day life. They've accommodated, right? They've made accommodations for it in their life. That's one hesitation. They don't know what they're missing. Two is, the research shows there's a very significant, what we call hearing aid effect or hearing aid impact, that people are perceived as either maybe not as educated or not as capable because they're wearing a hearing aid. And that, I think, is what part of the over-the-counter solution is trying to overcome, is trying to reduce that stigma, which will ultimately get patients to pursue some level of hearing support earlier on, rather than waiting the typical 7 years, which then leads to a lot of complications because there's now cognitive decline, there's central auditory processing issues, which just makes it much more difficult to be successful with a hearing device.
Okay. So a situation where, barring a situation where it's absolutely don't just go to the doctor. What do you run into, especially in a case like that where somebody maybe has been putting off, even looking into it or following up at all? Are there any kind of signs that you really need to go see a specialist and do this, or is over the counter a pretty good place to start for most people? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's always hard to know whether there's some medical or surgical need, right, in a case of hearing loss. It could be something as simple as wax. I mean, so I've had some patients actually buy like video otoscopes and look at their ears and say, oh yeah, that's why I'm not hearing well. I have a lot of wax. Let me go to the doctor. So I always recommend getting at least a baseline evaluation by an audiologist or an ENT. But if you're asking, what are the red flags that would say like, really don't put this off, is one, if the hearing loss happens suddenly, right? So we have that all the time. Oh, I thought my ears were clogged. I flew, I dove, and I wasn't hearing. And then they decide to, waddle into the office 3 months later. And lo and behold, they have a sudden hearing loss that we could have helped them with had they come in right away.
Sure.
And they would have restored their hearing.
Okay.
So if things happen suddenly, if there's a significant difference between the ears, that could indicate something more severe that we really have to investigate. So God forbid things like strokes, tumors, growths, those types of things. Any ringing in the ears, tinnitus or tinnitus, however you decide to pronounce it. It depends on, I've learned that it depends on what part of the world you're from. Some people say tinnitus, some people say tinnitus. If that is present, definitely get an evaluation. If dizziness, any kind of dizziness or imbalance, that is also an indication that potentially something more significant is going on. And then patients for whom hearing is of the utmost importance. So I'll tell you, I get a lot of patients who are either musicians, right, or sound engineers, investigative individuals like police officers, those types of things, that hearing is very important. Pilots, right? All of those, that kind of profile. I would say don't take a gamble when your hearing is at stake, and there's a lot of there's high stakes involved. Always best to just get a baseline evaluation at your closest hearing care professional.
That would be a bad day if you're a sound engineer and you find out your hearing is.
Yes. I had a patient who is a very, very accomplished musician, and unfortunately lost his hearing very suddenly due to some autoimmune disease, and waited a long time. And unfortunately we weren't able to restore a lot of his hearing, but he's doing okay now with hearing aids.
Oh, that's good. That's good news.
Yeah.
So the biggest question, cost. There's an obvious cost difference between over-the-counter hearing aids. You can pick them up for a couple $100, maybe up to $1,000 or $2. Prescription hearing aids, I remember my mother talking about spending $6,000 on a pair of hearing aids quite a while ago. What do you tell people? What are the benefits of that kind of money? What is the cost difference there, and where does the worth come from? What are people actually paying for when they pay for a prescription hearing aid?
Sure. Yeah. So it is it is partly, like I said, that customization element, right? So if you try an over-the-counter versus a prescription hearing aid, most of the times, I would say 98% of the time, patients will notice a significant difference. They didn't realize they can hear that well when it's really customized to their hearing loss. So there's that element, right? And that takes a high level of sophistication in order to adjust it, fine tune it for the patient, and also for all of the research and development that goes into the noise management portion of it, right? So that there's a lot of research and science that goes into trying to eliminate background noise, trying to restore the actual function of the ear that nature provides. That is very hard to restore digitally, right? So that's partly why, or part of the reason why prescriptive hearing aids are much more expensive than over-the-counter devices. Not to say that an over-the-counter device won't suffice for some patients, right? So that's why we say there's so many solutions. But if you start, like that patient started with an over-the-counter device, which is a great place to start, and you find that you're hearing better and you're curious, what is the difference in terms of sound quality and functionality, it's always great to at least get a trial or a test drive with a prescription device. And obviously that comes with professional support, right? So some patients really need that hand holding and can't do things on their own, or even if they believe they can do things on their own, when they come back with their hearing aids, they prove the state that they're in proves that they're not really able to maintain it on their own without professional support and guidance. So that does factor into the cost as well.
Can you talk about that for just a moment? What is involved when you have a prescription and they're things like tinnitus and other situations where only a prescription hearing aid can manage that stuff? What are some of those details? What can a prescription hearing aid actually do?
Yeah, so if, let's say, a patient has hearing loss and tinnitus together, right? Tinnitus comes or is present because there is some level of damage to the inner ear or the nerve, and the brain is sending a message to the ear that something is wrong, right? And if it's not corrected properly, either they can result in more damage, right? Or more exacerbation of their tinnitus. And so that's where the prescription device comes in, is that we can really hone in on where the issue is, right? We're programming it according to their levels of hearing loss. And so we're compensating for that decline in the nerve very specifically by frequency. And then if there is a tinnitus manager within the device, depending on the methodology, we are, again, rehabilitating exactly where the weakness is. And if we're giving, let's say, a masker, which is one of the common ways to manage tinnitus, it's frequency based off of their predominant areas of weakness and where the tinnitus lies. So there's a lot of research in how that specificity helps to reduce the impact of tinnitus, in addition to obviously other supports, so cognitive supports like cognitive behavioral therapy, tinnitus retraining therapy, and other options as well.
Okay. So just things that over-the-counter models are not going to be able to provide.
Yeah, exactly right. So that level of customization and that level of support is not present in a device that's not a prescription level.
Okay, perfect. So to wrap up, let's talk about real quick how overall recommend talking to a professional first, correct?
Yeah, I would definitely suggest that, especially if you have health insurance, typically an annual general checkup of your ears and hearing is something that would be covered. So I would definitely start there if that's an option. Alternatively, you can do a pretty comprehensive hearing screening online. I found actually that the Apple AirPod and the Apple hearing test that's done through the iPhone with the AirPods is actually fairly accurate. So it's actually pretty, although it doesn't diagnose the type of hearing loss in terms of the degree and configuration, it's pretty consistent with what we might find in like an audio booth under ideal circumstances. And then you can use your AirPods as like an over-the-counter device just to get started. So I think that's a good place to start. And then if you're curious, I think doing a test drive with a prescription device is highly recommended. Okay.
All right. And then last question, any mistakes to watch out for? Anything that, let's say over-the-counter, someone's considering an over-the-counter prescription, or sorry, somebody's considering an over-the-counter hearing aid. Any red flags, anything to look out for, anything to make their decision easier that you can add?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, on the hearing side, on the ear side, if this was a sudden change or you're noticing a difference between the ears, or like we said, the tinnitus, the dizziness, don't jump the gun and get the over-the-counter hearing aid. Get the evaluation first. And once you get the all clear, if you then want to pursue the over-the-counter device, then that I think is a fine option. One of the biggest, I've actually tested about 30 over-the-counter hearing aids in the lab. One of the biggest concerns that I have with the over-the-counter is some of them over amplify. So some of them are very, very loud, and patients not realizing that sometimes that over amplification can actually cause more damage is one of the biggest risk factors with the over-the-counter devices. So some of them over amplify, make things way too loud for patients, more than they need, which can result in actually noise-induced hearing loss. So just to be cautious with that. If you do feel that it's too loud, it's likely too loud. So take down the volume as much as possible, or return it and find an alternate, maybe lower gain solution.
And most of all, if you're concerned, talk to your audiologist, correct?
Yeah, I would say it definitely can't hurt just to get that professional insight.
Sounds good. All right. Well, I think that wraps it up. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us. This has been very insightful, and I really appreciate you taking the time today. Anything else before we sign off?
If anyone ever has any questions, I'm always willing to answer them. So you can reach me at either drruthreisman.com or urbanhearing.com, and I'm happy to help navigate this very large body of hearing aid waters, I would say. So thank you so much for the opportunity, and it's always a pleasure to work with you and your team, and I look forward to staying in touch in the future.